Most people think philosophy is about searching for truth, reflecting calmly, and respecting the great masters. Nietzsche disagreed. He called Socrates a degenerate, accused Plato of inventing a fake world, said Christianity is a slave morality and that compassion is just the excuse weak people use to feel virtuous. Nietzsche didn't want to reform philosophy. He wanted to blow it all up. This is the video where you'll see Nietzsche versus everyone, against reason, against morality, against faith, against other philosophers, and against you if you still believe in ready-made truths. Welcome to the battlefield. Few names inspire as much respect in the history of philosophy as Socrates. He's seen as the father of Western thought, a symbol of the tireless search for truth, a martyr of reason. But to Nietzsche, that sacred image hides something much darker. He doesn't see Socrates as a hero. He sees him as a symptom, a sign that Greek culture, once so vital and tragic, was starting to decay. For Nietzsche, Socrates didn't mark the height of thought, but the beginning of its downfall. In The Birth of Tragedy, one of Nietzsche's most poetic and foundational works, his criticism is subtle but powerful. He describes two primal forces in Greek culture: the Apollonian, tied to order, reason, and form, and the Dionysian, tied to chaos, passion, and raw life. The great Greek tragedians like Aeschylus and Sophocles knew how to balance these forces. They understood that life is pain, contradiction, and fleeting beauty. Then Socrates showed up. Socrates introduced a new kind of thinking, one that denied the tragic. He promoted the idea that reason could tame the world, solve human conflict, and lead to virtue. Nietzsche saw this as a huge mistake, or worse, a kind of cowardice. For him, Socratic reason wasn't a sign of strength, but of escape. Socrates was a misunderstanding. Morality is a degenerate form of human instinct, twilight of the idols. Nietzsche's critique gets even sharper in Twilight of the Idols. He points out that Socrates was physically ugly, unusual in a culture that linked beauty to virtue. But this ugliness, Nietzsche argues, reflected something deeper, an inner distortion, a resentful spirit trying to control life through logic because he couldn't fully live it. Why did Socrates think reason should dominate the instincts? Nietzsche's answer is unsettling. Because his instincts were weak, sick, and out of balance. Socrates wasn't a healthy man trying to improve the world. He was a bitter man trying to get back at life for not being able to enjoy it. This is a key point. Nietzsche sees excessive rationality as a sign of declining vitality. The greatest human moments for him don't come from explanation. They come from creation. Life is about force, will, instinct, and desire. When we reduce it to rules, formulas, and logic puzzles, we deny its most powerful essence. That's exactly what Socrates did. He turned existence into a math problem. With Socrates, Greek instinct went off track. Twilight of the Idols. Socrates believed no one does wrong willingly, and that all evil comes from ignorance. Nietzsche saw that as a naive attempt to moralize reality. If everything can be solved by knowledge, then tragedy, chaos, and irrationality vanish. Life's messy complexity is replaced by a tidy equation. But Nietzsche doesn't stop there. He sees Socrates as the starting point for a long chain of life-denying thinkers. From Socrates came Plato and his perfect world of ideas, a realm of purity beyond the senses. From Plato came Christianity, with its focus on sin and redemption. And later, Kant, with his moral absolutism. They all follow the Socratic, or logic, deny the here and now in favor of ideals, rules, and some beyond. Nietzsche asks, why do we need to justify life with ideas? Why can't we just affirm life as it is, with its pain, beauty, and contradiction? His answer, we can, but it takes strength. It takes the courage to stop running from the chaos. Socrates, in Nietzsche's view, lacked that courage. He couldn't bear the messiness of life, so he buried it under logic. This debate goes beyond philosophy. It touches something deeply existential. How should we live? With control or with intensity? With calculation or with passion? Socrates said we should think before we act. Nietzsche says we should act and then see what we think. But, to be clear, Nietzsche isn't anti-reason. He doesn't hate thinking. What he rejects is the worship of reason, the idea that it's the only thing that gives us value or meaning. Life, he says, doesn't fit inside an argument. Here's Nietzsche's challenge to all of us. Aren't we all children of Socrates, obsessed with answers, safety, control, and logical systems? We live in a time that prizes objectivity and precision, but maybe we've lost something vital in the process, the raw will to live fully, even without guarantees. Nietzsche offers a new ideal, the tragic spirit, the one who doesn't need to justify life, but embraces it, even in its chaos. He invites us to rediscover the Dionysian courage, the joy of existing with no absolute truths, just the fire of being alive. And that's why he attacks Socrates so fiercely, not out of intellectual disdain, but because Socrates became a symbol of a path Nietzsche believes we must outgrow. He doesn't want to destroy reason. He wants to free it from its throne, to put life back at the center, a life that pulses, stumbles, falls, rises, feels, and loves without needing to be perfect. Throughout the history of philosophy, few names shine as brightly as Plato. Student of Socrates, teacher of Aristotle, author of the Republic, and the father of metaphysical dualism, Plato shaped Western thought for centuries. But to Nietzsche, that brilliance casts a dark shadow. He didn't see Plato as a wise man leading humanity toward the light of reason. He saw him as the architect of a dangerous illusion, the denial of the real world in favor of an ideal one. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche doesn't hold back. Plato is the first great denier of life. When he created the theory of the world of ideas, a perfect, eternal, unchanging reality, Plato declared war on everything that's sensory, changing, imperfect. Nietzsche saw this as a profound act of resentment. What Plato really did, in his view, was run away from life, from pain, uncertainty, and impermanence, using metaphysics as a shield. The true world, finally unattainable, and with what right? A world invented, an idea made imperative, twilight of the idols. Nietzsche calls this Plato's great lie, the invention of two worlds, one perfect, ideal, and true, which we can never touch, and the other, flawed, deceptive, and corrupt, the one we actually live in. This split became the foundation of Platonism and later Christianity. According to Nietzsche, Platonism opened the door to Western nihilism because it teaches people to despise real life in favor of some imaginary beyond. Here's the core of his criticism. Plato didn't just invent a fictional world, he placed it above life. He claimed truth exists outside of time, the body, and sensory experience. Nietzsche responds, that's a betrayal of life. Real life happens right here, right now, in pain and joy, in chaos and fleeting beauty. Creating a better world implies that this one isn't good enough. For Nietzsche, that's unacceptable. But why would Plato do that? Nietzsche suggests that underneath Plato's philosophy is a deep disgust for reality. The theory of ideas didn't come from a life-affirming spirit, it came from a resentful one. Like Socrates, Plato couldn't bear life as it is, so he invented one as it should be. Nietzsche sees that not as strength, but as weakness and denial. The concept of the true world was finally useless, abolished. What remains? The apparent world? No. Along with the true world, we've also abolished the apparent. Twilight of the idols. This is one of Nietzsche's boldest moments. He doesn't just want to reject Plato's world of ideas. He wants to redeem the world of the senses, the body, imperfection, and multiplicity. He flips everything. The so-called apparent world, according to Nietzsche, is the only world, and it's more than enough. The philosopher's job isn't to escape life, but to dive into it fully. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche calls philosophers like Plato ascetic types, people who hate life and create elaborate systems to justify that hatred. He writes, "Philosophy is, in most cases, the personal confession of its author. His values are his own prejudices, dressed up as universal principles. So, Platonism isn't neutral. It comes from a worldview steeped in moralism, distrust of the senses, and fear of change. And Nietzsche wants to leave all of that behind. To him, philosophy should be born from life, not from its denial. But he doesn't stop there. Nietzsche shows how Platonism has seeped into almost everything. Christianity, for example, is Platonism for the masses, the promise of a perfect heaven after a life of suffering, the idea of an eternal, unchanging God above the world. All of it, Nietzsche says, echoes Plato. Even Western thought's obsession with absolute truths is rooted in this legacy. That's why he writes, with biting irony, "We've turned Platonism upside down. What was beneath must rise, beyond good and evil." This reversal means exactly what it sounds like, valuing the body over the soul, the sensory over the abstract, the present over the eternal, instinct over reason. He's not rejecting thinking. He's rooting it back into real life. Nietzsche wants a philosophy that comes from the muscles, the blood, the earth, not from the fear of being human. His attack on Plato isn't just theoretical, it's existential. Nietzsche is saying that as long as we believe life needs a better world to be meaningful, we're denying the richness of this one. He's calling for a total shift in thinking, to affirm life without needing some higher justification, and that takes courage. Because living without Plato, without fixed ideals, heavenly rewards, or eternal truths, is stepping into the abyss of freedom. Nietzsche knew that, but he also knew that only those who face that abyss can create new values. That's where his concept of the Übermensch is born, the one who rises above inherited morality and creates meaning from within. So Nietzsche's criticism of Plato isn't a simple rejection, it's a call to greatness. He's inviting us to stop being shadows at the back of the cave and finally walk out into the sunlight. Not the sterile light of perfect ideas, but the real, warm, imperfect, beautiful light of this world. The world is here. The time is now. Few philosophers had as much early influence on Nietzsche as Arthur Schopenhauer, and few were so completely surpassed by him. Nietzsche discovered Schopenhauer when he was young and was nearly obsessed. He called him a true educator, a mirror of the soul. But over time, that admiration turned into a break. Not out of contempt, but out of necessity. Nietzsche realized that if he followed Schopenhauer all the way, there would be no room left for creation, only renunciation. And that he could never accept. In The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer presents a deeply pessimistic view of reality. At its core, the world isn't reason, or spirit, or God. It's blind, irrational, relentless will. This will shows up in every living thing as craving, impulse, and lack. Life is suffering, Schopenhauer says, because to desire is to never be satisfied. Every achievement leads to another void. All of existence is just an endless game of unmet desire. So, what's the solution? The denial of the will. Influenced by Buddhism and Christian asceticism, Schopenhauer claimed that liberation lies in giving up desire, silencing the will, reaching a kind of philosophical nirvana. Art, aesthetic contemplation, and compassion are paths toward this quieting of the will. But the ultimate goal is a full renunciation of life. At first, Nietzsche was captivated by this tragic vision. Schopenhauer's honesty felt refreshing, compared to the shallow optimism of modernity. But soon Nietzsche saw what he believed was a betrayal hiding in plain sight. Schopenhauer recognized the pain of existence, but instead of confronting it, he ran from it. He tried to conquer life through denial and retreat. Schopenhauer was honest, but his honesty was of a sick kind. He saw life as something to be rejected. I see life as something to be affirmed, exe homo. That was Nietzsche's turning point. He kept Schopenhauer's critique of fake modern happiness, but refused to accept renunciation as the answer. Where Schopenhauer says, give up, Nietzsche says, fight. Where Schopenhauer says, abandon the will, Nietzsche says, will more. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche marks his break from his former teacher. He begins to see the will, that chaotic, creative force Schopenhauer cursed, not as a burden, but as the very essence of life. The will shouldn't be denied, but embraced, strengthened, and transformed. It's through will that creators are born, artists, thinkers, those who dare to say yes to life, even in its pain. Life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced intensely. The Gay Science. Nietzsche doesn't deny that suffering exists. He just refuses to use it as a reason to reject life. In fact, suffering is the soil where greatness grows. Avoiding pain means avoiding the heights too. That's why Schopenhauer's passive nihilism, giving up on life because it hurts, is, to Nietzsche, a spiritual illness, a burnout of the will to live. To counter this, Nietzsche offers his answer, the will to power. If life is desire, we shouldn't kill it. We should aim it, expand it, intensify it. Human beings aren't meant to rest. They're meant to create, to shape, to rise. The will isn't a curse, it's fuel. Schopenhauer believed the wise. Man silences his impulses. Nietzsche believes the wise man transforms them into creation. Art, philosophy, a life lived as a work of art. All of it flows from elevated will, not from denial. Suffering isn't something to avoid, it's part of the masterpiece. This contrast becomes even clearer in Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence. Imagine having to live your life exactly as it is, all the pain, all the joy, all the failures and victories, over and over, forever. Would that be a curse or a blessing? For Schopenhauer, no doubt, it would be hell. But Nietzsche flips the idea into the ultimate test of affirmation. Only those who love life entirely can wish for it to return eternally. Tell me, do you desire this life once more and countless times more? Then you have loved it. The Gay Science. Nietzsche didn't hate Schopenhauer. He respected him deeply, but he broke away because life demands more. It's not enough to understand suffering. We have to respond to it through creation, not escape. Schopenhauer sees the tragedy of existence. Nietzsche turns it into a stage for greatness. In doing so, Nietzsche rejects pessimism and offers a new ethic, an ethic of affirmation. No more renunciation, no more submission, no more compassion as escape. The new morality will be built by those who love life, not despite suffering, but alongside it. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Twilight of the Idols. This famous quote says it all. It's the essence of Nietzsche's triumph over Schopenhauer. Suffering isn't a flaw to erase, it's a challenge to overcome. The will isn't a burden, it's a rising force. Nietzsche wanted more than contemplation. He wanted dance, laughter, pain, and glory. He wanted tragedy, not complaint. He broke with Schopenhauer because he didn't just want to understand the world. He wanted to transform it, to live it, to affirm it to the very end. And now I ask you, do you believe the answer to suffering is in denying desire, like Schopenhauer said, or in courageously affirming life, as Nietzsche dared to propose? If something in you stirs while hearing this, don't ignore it. Subscribe to the channel and keep challenging the old values with us. Among all of Nietzsche's critiques throughout his work, few are as controversial as the one directed at the figure of Jesus Christ. But let's be clear, Nietzsche doesn't hate Jesus. In fact, he respects him, and in some ways, even admires him. What he despises isn't the man, but what was done with him. Nietzsche's critique isn't aimed at the historical Jesus, but at what he became, the ultimate symbol of a morality that denies life. In the Antichrist, Nietzsche opens with a provocative line. What is good? All that enhances the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is evil? All that stems from weakness. And it's through this lens that he judges Christianity, and, by extension, Jesus. But Nietzsche's judgment is more nuanced than it seems. He clearly separates Jesus as an individual from Christianity as an institution. The first, he respects. The second, he wages war against. Nietzsche saw Jesus as almost a Buddhist figure, someone who lived his inner truth fully, without resentment, moved by a love that didn't demand, didn't condemn, didn't seek control. Jesus, to Nietzsche, was someone who didn't resist evil with violence, didn't demand earthly justice, didn't seek power. His original message was, in Nietzsche's view, more like a gospel of inner peace, a pure experience of love, not a rigid moral doctrine. Jesus died too soon. Had he lived longer, he might have prevented his message from being hijacked by the resentful. The Antichrist. The tragedy, Nietzsche argues, is that this remarkable figure was turned into an idol and his life into dogma. His gesture of love was reinterpreted as a redemptive sacrifice. His inner freedom became external moral law, and that's where what Nietzsche calls Christian morality begins. A morality based on guilt, sin, submission, and self-punishment. A morality that serves the weak and denies life in the name of the hereafter. Nietzsche accuses Christianity of flipping all vital values upside down. Where life celebrates strength, growth, and overcoming, Christianity praises humility, self-denial, chastity, and suffering. The Christian ideal is one of life denied, the ideal of the last man, obedient, safe, content, but without greatness. To Nietzsche, that's a spiritual crime. Christianity is a metaphysics of executioners. The Antichrist. In his reading, the cross is not a symbol of salvation. It marks the downfall of the life-affirming Dionysian spirit that thrived in ancient cultures. By making suffering sacred, Christianity turned weakness into a virtue. It transformed resentment into morality. So what does Nietzsche mean by this? To him, resentment is the hidden engine of Christian morality. The weak, unable to affirm their own power, flip the script. Instead of admiring greatness, they call it pride. Instead of seeking strength, they call it sin. They turn their own powerlessness into a virtue, and in doing so, create a morality that justifies their condition. Nietzsche calls this herd morality, a code designed to tame the strong and keep the weak safe. The problem is, this morality isn't just false, it's destructive. It denies everything vital, creative, and powerful in human beings. It teaches us that the body is dirty, that desire is sinful, that pleasure is suspect. It makes us passive, guilty, submissive, all in the name of a world that doesn't exist, the kingdom of heaven. The other world was invented to devalue this one. The Antichrist. Nietzsche then offers the opposite kind of philosophy. He wants to destroy the morality of the weak and build in its place a morality that affirms life. This doesn't mean selfishness or cruelty, as some mistakenly believe, but rather a celebration of growth, creation, power, and desire. He wants a morality that comes from our strongest instincts, not their denial. At this point, it becomes clear Nietzsche versus Jesus is really Nietzsche versus the Christian interpretation of Jesus. The true tragic figure, Nietzsche says, is the Jesus who died without hate, without judgment, without resentment, someone who lived his truth fully. But that man was hijacked by the church, by doctrine, by theologians, and turned into a tool for control, a symbol of guilt and submission. Nietzsche writes with disdain, "What the believers worship isn't Christ. It's suffering itself, weakness itself. They worship his defeated image, the Antichrist." And that's what he fights against. Not Jesus' love, but the institution that turned love into law. Not spiritual freedom, but moralism. Not the living Christ, but the crucified one, made into an icon of shame. That's why Nietzsche doesn't call us back to Jesus. He calls for a complete break from Christianity. The death of God, for him, marks the start of a new age, one where we can rebuild, create new values. The era of the Übermensch, the human who creates meaning from within, without needing salvation, redemption, or forgiveness. Nietzsche's invitation is clear. We don't need to live under the shadow of the cross. We can and must rediscover our greatness, not as gods, but as beings who affirm life in all its messiness, pain, pleasure, chaos, beauty, destruction, and rebirth. Nietzsche doesn't hold back when it comes to Christian morality. His critique is ruthless, and one of his main targets is St. Augustine, the father of Western Christian theology, the architect of original sin, the theorist of guilt passed down through generations. To Nietzsche, Augustine was a genius, but a genius of decline, a builder of mental prisons that shaped how the West thinks, feels, and judges itself for centuries. In On the Genealogy of Morality and the Antichrist, Nietzsche breaks down the moral foundations of Christian tradition. He's not just arguing with doctrine. He's trying to understand how values like humility, guilt, chastity, and denial of pleasure became central to Western ethics, and who benefited from that. And at the heart of that shift, Nietzsche places Augustine. He asks, where did the idea come from that desire is wrong? That the body is corrupt? That pleasure is dangerous? His answer points to Augustine, a man who, after living a youth of indulgence, converted to Christianity and projected his inner conflicts onto all of humanity. Faith means not wanting to know what is true. The Antichrist. For Nietzsche, Augustine's famous line, "Lord, make me chaste and pure, but not yet," isn't just a confession. It reveals a soul torn by guilt, and Augustine turned that guilt into a system. From his personal struggle with desire, he developed the doctrine of original sin, the belief that we're all born guilty, marked by a mistake from the beginning of time. It's no longer about doing wrong. We are wrong by nature. To Nietzsche, this was the birth of a morality of submission. Humanity is brought to its knees. To be is to sin. To feel is to sin. To exist is to be guilty. The only salvation. Deny yourself. Kill your desires. Obey the commandments. Wait for forgiveness from a God who loves you and condemns you at the same time. Nietzsche doesn't see this as morality. He sees it as spiritual torture. Christianity gave Eros poison to drink. He did not die, but degenerated into a vice. Twilight of the idols. By blending Neoplatonic thought into his theology, Augustine deepened the split between body and soul, matter and spirit. He taught that the body was a prison for the soul, and that only by rejecting worldly pleasures could we be set free. Nietzsche sees this as a betrayal of life, forced spiritualization, hatred of the body, glorification of suffering, all signs for him of a culture in decline, one that can no longer affirm existence with strength. Nietzsche's critique is, above all, a critique of asceticism, this moral framework that glorifies fasting, celibacy, self-punishment, and renunciation, as if virtue comes from slowly destroying yourself. And Augustine, according to Nietzsche, played a huge role in spreading this mindset among Christians. The rejection of the body, of sex, of laughter, of dancing, of joy, all of that became holy, pure, elevated, But Nietzsche sees it as resentment disguised as sanctity. The ascetic ideal is a will to nothingness, on the genealogy of morality. This leads to one of Nietzsche's deepest ideas, ressentiment. The weak, unable to affirm life or their instincts, take revenge on existence by creating a morality where weakness becomes goodness, suffering becomes virtue, and pleasure becomes sin. Ressentiment is what turns impotence into a moral value. And Christianity, Nietzsche says, is its most successful expression, with Augustine as its chief theorist. But his critique isn't just personal or psychological. Nietzsche sees this kind of morality serving a political purpose. It creates obedient, timid, guilt-ridden subjects, people who depend on divine authority and on the earthly institutions that claim to represent it. A humanity trained to say no to itself is easy to control. Augustine may not have planned this, but Nietzsche sees the result clearly. A herd, not free individuals. Nietzsche also takes issue with Augustine's idea of time and history. In The City of God, Augustine divides reality into two realms: the earthly city, corrupt, temporary, fallen, and the city of God, eternal, pure, and unreachable in this life. To Nietzsche, this is escapism. It's contempt for real life in favor of a made-up metaphysical promise. Once again, life is denied in favor of an imagined beyond. But Nietzsche doesn't just want to destroy this tradition. He wants to free the human spirit. He wants a morality born from power, not guilt, an ethic based on self-creation, on loving one's destiny, on accepting the body, desires, and the joy of being alive. What he offers is a new kind of spirituality, not built on renunciation, but on affirmation. The famous concept of amor fati, love of one's fate, is the complete opposite of Augustine's morality. Where Augustine sees sin, Nietzsche sees strength. Where Augustine sees a fall, Nietzsche sees an opportunity to rise. Where Augustine begs for forgiveness, Nietzsche says, "Become who you are." This isn't empty criticism, it's a challenge. Nietzsche wants readers to look inward and ask, how much guilt am I carrying that isn't mine? How many desires have I buried because I was afraid of being bad? How many times have I rejected life in the name of an ideal that was never mine to begin with? Nietzsche wants to free our morality from theology, our minds from guilt, and our bodies from shame. He wants us to live fully, consciously, intensely. And for that, we have to let go of Augustine's legacy. Not to hate it, but to move beyond it. So now I ask you, is the morality of guilt still holding us back? And are you ready to let go of inherited ideas that no longer serve your life? In the history of philosophy, few names are as respected as Immanuel Kant. His ethics of duty, his belief in practical reason, and his idea of a universal moral law made him a pillar of modern thought. But for Nietzsche, this morality wasn't progress, it was a symptom of decline. To him, Kant was just another philosopher trying to trap human beings in an abstract, artificial system that denied life in favor of distant, idealized values. Nietzsche's critique of Kant's moral system is sharp and uncompromising. In Beyond Good and Evil and on the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche tears apart what he sees as the central mistake in Kant's thinking: the belief that there's a universal moral law, valid for all rational beings, independent of culture, history, the body, personal desires, or real-life experience. Kant's famous categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim, by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, is, for Nietzsche, the height of rationalist delusion. German moral philosophers, Kant for example, are the greatest self-deceivers. They think they're discovering moral principles through pure reason, when they're really just rationalizing their inherited prejudices. Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche accuses Kant of turning his strict Protestant moral background, rigid, obedient, self-denying, into a universal law of reason. He argues that Kant didn't uncover eternal moral truths. He built a system to protect the values he already believed in, values that domesticate human beings, suppress instincts, and disguise herd morality as rationality. That's why Nietzsche completely rejects the idea of one morality for all. For him, there is no universal moral essence. Every morality is an expression of power, either the power of life or the weakness of decay. Every morality has a history, a political function, a psychological origin. Morality isn't eternal. Truth, it's a human invention, often born from resentment. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche urges us to ask, where do our ideas of right and wrong come from? Who benefits from them? His answer is unsettling. The morality that praises humility, obedience, self-denial, and duty, so central to Kant's philosophy, isn't the product of pure reason. It's the result of the weak overpowering the strong by redefining what's good. Originally, good referred to the powerful, the noble, the rulers. Bad referred to the weak, the outcast. It was resentment that flipped those values upside down. On the Genealogy of Morals. In this context, Nietzsche sees Kant as an unknowing accomplice to resentment. By proposing a morality based on absolute, impersonal principles, Kant helps reinforce a moral system that denies individuality, suppresses the will, and turns ethics into cold obedience. But Nietzsche digs even deeper. He challenges the very foundation of Kant's ethics, the separation of reason from life. For Kant, morality must not be based on desires, emotions, or outcomes. It must be pure, autonomous, driven only by reason. Nietzsche responds, that's fantasy. It rips morality away from the body, the instincts, and lived experience, and places it in a sterile world of unreachable ideals. For Nietzsche, human beings aren't first and foremost rational creatures. We are beings of will, desire, conflict, and creativity. Reducing ethics to reason alone is like cutting off part of what makes us human. It turns people into obedient machines instead of free spirits. And that's exactly what Nietzsche wants to recover. Freedom. In attacking Kant, Nietzsche is issuing a powerful call to free morality from its transcendent chains. He wants a morality that comes from life, from power, from affirmation, not from obedience. He writes, "What we need is a revaluation of all values, to unmask false moral idols, expose their sick origins, and create new standards, not universal ones, but individual ones, beyond good and evil." That's the core of his philosophical proposal, a transvaluation of values. Instead of one, rule for everyone, Nietzsche wants each person of strength to create their own values, based on their will to power, their individuality, their unique experience of life. While Kant dreams of a world united under shared rational principles, Nietzsche envisions a pluralistic humanity, made up of free spirits, self-creators, who don't bow to abstract systems, but shape their own lives with courage and creativity. Nietzsche's vision of ethics is challenging and deeply liberating. Yes, it demands responsibility, but not the responsibility of following external rules. It asks for responsibility for yourself, to create meaning, to carry the weight of your own existence without relying on ready-made formulas. Nietzsche doesn't want everyone to follow the same path. He wants each of us to discover who we are and act from that truth. That's not moral chaos. That's affirmative ethics. That's a life-driven ethic. That's the opposite of duty. It's the morality of power. So now I ask you, do you believe there's one morality that fits everyone like Kant believed? Or do you think each of us has to create our own ethical path, as Nietzsche argued? Nietzsche rarely mentions Hegel directly in his writings, but that doesn't mean he ignored him. Quite the opposite. Nietzsche's critiques of Hegel are like hidden blades, indirect but razor sharp. They're scattered mostly throughout: the will to power, where Nietzsche firmly rejects what he sees as one of the greatest illusions of modern philosophy, the idea that history has meaning, a final purpose, or a destined end. In other words, Nietzsche doesn't see history as progress. He sees it as a battlefield, a struggle of forces, a stage of chaos. And Hegel, with his grand philosophy of spirit, represents everything Nietzsche fights against. For Hegel, history is rational in its totality. Even when it seems chaotic or senseless, it's still moving toward a goal, the realization of human freedom. Through constant conflict, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, human consciousness evolves, overcomes contradictions and advances toward higher forms of awareness. Reason is unfolding through time. For Hegel, humanity is always self-surpassing. Nietzsche looks at this idea with deep suspicion. To him, this supposed historical progress is just a metaphysical fantasy dressed up as philosophy. It's a desperate attempt to impose meaning on a world that, at its core, has no predefined purpose. History, Nietzsche says, isn't a straight path toward improvement. It's a violent dance of creation and destruction. History has no meaning. It's not heading toward any goal. It simply repeats through cycles of decline and strength. The will to power. Nietzsche sees Hegel's teleology, the idea that history has a built-in purpose, as a leftover from Christianity. Hegel may sound secular, but Nietzsche believes his structure is deeply religious. The promise of salvation is replaced by the realization of absolute spirit. Heaven becomes the ethical state, but the hunger for ultimate meaning remains the same. Nietzsche asks, why do we need so badly to believe that history is going somewhere? Why can't we accept that life might be absurd, circular, without a destination? His answer, because we're afraid. We crave comfort. We want order. We want to believe there's a plan, even if it's wrapped in dialectical philosophy. To Nietzsche, that illusion is dangerous. If you think history is automatically progressing, you start justifying everything that happens as necessary, as part of some cosmic unfolding. That leads to a kind of paralyzing conformity. If everything is heading in the right direction anyway, why resist? Why create? Why fight? Faith in progress is the religion of modernity, and like all religions, it's a denial of life, the will to power. Nietzsche breaks sharply from this idea. To him, life isn't spirit unfolding, it's will to power. It's a raw force, a drive to create, to surpass, to transform. History isn't leading us somewhere. We create and recreate it through our own force. Where Hegel sees reason as the driver of history, Nietzsche sees it as a secondary tool. Life doesn't follow reason. Life drags reason along. Our values, our ideas, our moral systems don't come from logical dialectics. They come from instincts, drives, from deeper forces that either affirm or reject existence. That's why Nietzsche also rejects Hegel's idea of the state as the embodiment of ethical reason. For Hegel, the modern state is the peak of freedom. For Nietzsche, that's laughable. The state is often a machine that flattens the individual, enforces conformity, and suppresses greatness. What Hegel calls historical rationality, Nietzsche sees as moral leveling, the triumph of the herd. The state is the place where great individuals are crushed under the weight of the average, the will to power. Nietzsche also rejects Hegel's dialectics as a method of thinking. He doesn't believe truth comes from rationally resolving contradictions. Conflict, for Nietzsche, is eternal. It's not something we fix, it's something we dance with. The Hegelian idea of overcoming contradictions is just another attempt to tame the chaos of life, when, in fact, it's from chaos that real creation is born. Nietzsche's alternative is the idea of eternal recurrence. History isn't a line, it's a circle. Everything returns. Everything repeats. There's no final goal, only the challenge of affirming each moment as if it were eternal. This is a direct attack on teleology. If history isn't going anywhere, then the only thing left is the radical responsibility to live the now. with intensity. Nietzsche calls us to a new stance toward time. Don't wait, don't trust in progress, don't rely on history, act, create values, forge paths, affirm life, even in the face of absurdity. He replaces faith in historical reason with faith in the tragic creator, the one who doesn't ask, "Where are we going?" but instead declares, "I am the beginning." It's a harder path, more raw, but infinitely more free. Because when we free history from its supposed destiny, we free the individual too. We're no longer subjects of some grand plan. We're the authors, not just the characters. So here's the question. Do you believe history is heading somewhere? Or is it up to us to give it meaning every day through our actions, choices, and creations? Rousseau once said, "Man is born good, it is society that corrupts him." For many, that phrase marks a hopeful shift in modern philosophy, a belief in the goodness of human nature. But for Nietzsche, it's poison disguised as kindness. Rousseau, the philosopher of the social contract and compassion, represents, in Nietzsche's eyes, one of the key architects of slave morality, the glorification of mediocrity, and the denial of our deepest vital instincts. Nietzsche never wrote a full book attacking Rousseau, but the critiques are scattered throughout his work, especially in On the Genealogy of Morality, where he breaks down the roots of the values we've inherited. And in that breakdown, Rousseau stands for everything Nietzsche wants to challenge. The idea that all people are naturally equal and that compassion should be the foundation of morality. Let's break it down. Rousseau believed that in a natural state, before private property and social inequality, humans were essentially good, free, and equal. Corruption, he said, came with civilization. His solution? Rebuild society on just foundations, where the general will ensures equality and freedom for all. Nietzsche sees this as a romantic fantasy, and a dangerous one. To him, Rousseau was a resentful thinker who turned his disdain for the powerful into a philosophy of leveling. Equality, Nietzsche argues, isn't about justice. It's envy disguised as virtue. It's the cry of the weak who can't stand the existence of the strong, so they create a morality that brings everyone down. The concept of equality is a moral disguise for the instinct of revenge. On the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche believed people aren't born equal, and they shouldn't be. Life is by nature unequal. There's a hierarchy of strength, ability, and vitality. Wanting everyone to be the same is like demanding all bodies be the same height, the same intensity, the same voice. It erases uniqueness. It flattens life. And that brings us to the second big issue, compassion. Rousseau saw compassion as a natural emotion, something that connected us to the suffering of others. For him, pity was the root of moral life. Nietzsche, on the other hand, saw compassion as weakness disguised as virtue, a feeling that, rather than uplifting, actually brings everything down, both the giver and the receiver. Compassion is unnatural. It preserves what is ready to perish. On the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche believed that when compassion becomes the highest value, it holds us back. It stifles growth. It blocks transformation. When we're trained to protect weakness at all costs, we start worshipping it. Suffering becomes sacred. Victimhood becomes virtue, and life loses its strength. That doesn't mean Nietzsche promoted cruelty. He wasn't against caring. What he rejected was the kind of morality that turns suffering into a badge of honor. That says the one who suffers is automatically good, and that the strong should feel guilty for being strong. That reversal of values, Nietzsche says, starts with thinkers like Rousseau and ends in Christian and socialist morality. Compassion is a disguised form of nihilism. It denies life in the name of saving it. The will to power. For Nietzsche, real ethics come not from compassion, but from creation. True value is found in overcoming, in affirming life even through pain, in saying yes to chaos and difference. He urges us to let go of pity-based morality and embrace an ethics of strength, one that doesn't level, but lifts. Rousseau's vision of an equal society, built on the general will, ends up, in Nietzsche's view, reducing the individual to just another part of the herd. The freedom Rousseau praises becomes, in practice, a new form of submission to the group, to common morality, to the majority. And that, Nietzsche says, is unacceptable. Where there is equality, there is no greatness. Beyond good and evil, Nietzsche wants to bring greatness back. He wants a culture that celebrates the exceptional, encourages difference, and honors creative strength. He believes that equality kills the free spirit, and that compassion, when made absolute, doesn't heal pain. It makes it permanent. This clash between Rousseau and Nietzsche isn't just philosophical. It's existential. Rousseau believed humans need protection from society to become good. Nietzsche believed humans need to face life head-on, its brutality, its beauty, to become strong. Rousseau longs for a lost innocence. Nietzsche calls for transcendence, for the revaluation of all values. Rousseau believed in the natural man. Nietzsche believed in the Übermensch, the person who recreates themselves from the chaos, who affirms life without apology, who rejects inherited morality and becomes the author of their own being. So here's the question: should equality be an absolute value? Or are we suffocating what's most unique in each of us by trying to make everyone the same? Charles Darwin revolutionized modern thinking by showing that life evolves through natural selection. The organisms best adapted to their environment survive, and the weaker ones disappear. According to Darwin, the struggle for survival is the driving force behind evolution. But for Nietzsche, this explanation is not just incomplete, it's deeply reductive. Life in its essence isn't driven by the need to survive, but by something far more powerful: the will to power. Nietzsche didn't totally reject Darwin. He recognized the importance of evolutionary theory and saw natural selection as a break from religious, purpose-driven views of the world. But for Nietzsche, reducing life to mere adaptation drains it of its depth. Life isn't just a biological calculation. It's an overflow of energy, a creative force, a desire to expand beyond what's useful or necessary. Life doesn't aim to preserve itself. It aims to grow, to dominate, to overcome, beyond good and evil. This is where Nietzsche draws a hard line. Where Darwin sees life as a fight to keep existing, Nietzsche sees it as a drive to constantly become more. Survival is the bare minimum. To create, to transform, to assert, that's what defines life at its highest. In On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche critiques the idea that human values can be explained purely by their usefulness for survival or social cohesion. He rejects the utilitarian mindset that says morality is just what helps keep groups together. For him, that's the sign of a culture that's lost touch with life's deeper impulses. Nietzsche believed that the greatest moments in human history didn't come from adapting, but from breaking boundaries. Geniuses, artists, philosophers, free spirits, they didn't just adapt to their surroundings. They reshaped the world. They defied the norms. They imposed new values. The morality of fitting in can't explain human greatness. What's more harmful than any vice? Active compassion for the failures and weak. On the Genealogy of Morality. Darwin's idea of selection says the strong survive because they're better adapted. Nietzsche replies, the truly strong don't adapt. They bend the world to their will. They don't accept their environment. They challenge it. That's what it means to live with will to power. This concept, will to power, is central to Nietzsche's philosophy and his critique of Darwinism. Life isn't just about fighting to stay alive. It's about affirming existence with intensity. Life wants more life. It wants to grow, to expand, to dominate, not out of need, but out of overflowing energy. That's why Nietzsche sees Darwinism as a kind of biological nihilism, a view of life stripped down to mechanics, to survival, as the end goal. That, for him, kills creativity. Darwinism might explain how life continues, but not what makes it meaningful or extraordinary. Nietzsche also warns of the moral danger in this kind of thinking. If we start seeing life only as a struggle for survival, we start justifying mediocrity as success. Life stops being an art and becomes a spreadsheet. Value becomes about efficiency, not depth or beauty. Everything great in culture goes against the economy of life, beyond good and evil in other words, the most creative, daring, and vital aspects of life are often useless in Darwinian terms. But that's exactly what Nietzsche wants to preserve. Dance, poetry, tragic courage, radical thinking, none of these help us survive directly, but they make life worth living. Nietzsche asks, do we really just want to survive, or do we want to live fully? Are we content to be well-adapted organisms, or do we want to be creators of meaning and shapers of destiny? The real difference between Darwin and Nietzsche is their view of what it means to be human. For Darwin, we're the result of millions of years of adaptation. For Nietzsche, we're a work in progress, a force in motion, a possibility for overcoming. Not a finished product, a process becoming something more. That's where the Übermensch comes in, the Overman, the one who breaks from inherited values, who doesn't settle for fitting in, but dares to create new ways of living. This kind of human doesn't fit into Darwin's scheme. They're not just surviving, they're affirming life with such intensity that they become something new altogether. Nietzsche calls for an ethic of transgression, elevation, and value creation. And for that, Darwinian theory isn't enough. Science may explain the mechanics of life, the how. But Nietzsche wants to answer the why. And that answer, he says, can only come from philosophy, from art, from the creative spirit. So now think about it. Are you just surviving, or are you really living? If something inside you stirs when you hear these ideas, don't ignore it. Subscribe to the channel and keep challenging the old values with us. Nietzsche rarely mentions Karl Marx by name. His main targets were Christianity, Kant, Rousseau, and the moralists. But his criticisms of resentment-based morality, of compassion turned into moral law, and of equality as an absolute value strike at the heart of socialist thought. To Nietzsche, socialism isn't a revolution, it's a reaction, a refined expression of the same weakness he sees in Christian morality. And Marx, even if not directly cited, becomes the modern archetype of the moralist driven by resentment, someone who wants to bring everyone down in the name of so-called justice. Modern socialism is the most extreme degeneration of Christian morality, the will to power, posthumous notes. To understand this indirect clash between Nietzsche and Marx, we need to explore a central idea in Nietzsche's critique: resentment. In On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche explains how dominant Western values, humility, equality, compassion, forgiveness, didn't come from strength or vitality, but from deep resentment. The weak, unable to assert their will, flipped the values. They called their weakness a virtue, their helplessness goodness, and their obedience morality. This value reversal, Nietzsche says, is exactly what we see in socialism. The calls for equality and justice are, at their core, expressions of envy, not a cry for true freedom, but a cry for revenge, not against oppression itself, but against the very existence of those who are stronger, wealthier, more creative. Marx talks about class struggle, but to Nietzsche, this isn't a legitimate fight for emancipation. It's the herd lashing out at anyone who stands out. They say, everyone should be equal. But what they really mean is, no one should be better than us. On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche doesn't defend exploitation or oppression. That would be a misreading of his philosophy. What he rejects is the moral foundation of egalitarianism, the denial of natural differences, of spontaneous hierarchies, of power as a source of value. Life, he says, is unequal by nature, People differ in strength, talent, and drive. Trying to erase this in the name of justice is, to Nietzsche, an attack on life itself. And here comes his sharpest point. Socialism denies the will to power. Instead of encouraging growth, greatness, and value creation, it celebrates mediocrity, conformity, and submission to the collective. Marx said, "Capitalism alienates us from our work." Nietzsche would say we're domesticated by moral systems that kill ambition. This critique also appears strongly in the Antichrist, where Nietzsche connects Christianity and socialism as two sides of the same coin, the morality of the weak. Christianity promises paradise after earthly suffering. Socialism promises paradise here on earth after revolution, but both feed off the same illusion, that suffering gives you moral superiority. Christianity is a form of nihilism. It turns suffering into virtue, weakness into moral power. Socialism does the same. The Antichrist. Marx saw history as a class struggle moving toward the end of oppression and the rise of a classless society. Nietzsche hated this kind of teleological thinking, which he saw as borrowed from Hegel. For Nietzsche, history has no direction, no purpose, no moral arc. There is no progress, only constant clashes of forces. What Marx sees as injustice, Nietzsche sees as an inevitable part of life's struggle. Nietzsche also rejects the idea that the suffering of the poor or oppressed automatically grants moral authority. He calls this herd morality, where pain becomes a political currency. For Nietzsche, morality based on compassion and equality doesn't liberate, it paralyzes. It holds back the strong, smothers creativity, and kills the drive to overcome. Compassion is the tool used to cancel out strength. On the genealogy of morality, Marx wanted to abolish private property and build an equal society. Nietzsche, on the other hand, wanted to destroy the very idea of equality as a virtue. He envisioned a new aristocracy, not of blood, but of spirit, a culture that honors creators, outsiders, the rare ones, those who rise above herd values and carve their own paths. To Nietzsche, real freedom doesn't come from equality, it comes from embracing difference. The problem with socialism isn't economic, it's moral. It comes from a worldview shaped by resentment and builds an ethic where anything exceptional becomes suspicious. Greatness is called arrogance. Ambition becomes selfishness. A society like that may be fair, but it will never be great. Nietzsche isn't telling us to despise the weak, but to stop building entire cultures around them. Yes, there is suffering, injustice, and pain, but he refuses to turn that into a moral foundation. The answer, he says, isn't to flatten everyone, but to lift up those who can go further. The future belongs to those who dare to affirm life, even when everything around them tries to tame, equalize, and standardize. And now I ask you, does the morality of equality and resentment still shape our ideas of justice? Are we, in trying to protect the weak, actually smothering the strong? I think therefore I am. With this phrase, René Descartes became the father of modern philosophy. In a time of doubt and collapsing certainties, he searched for something absolutely solid to stand on, and found it in thought. Even if I doubt everything, Descartes said, I'm still the one doing the doubting. Therefore, I exist. The thinking self became the foundation of all reality, the ultimate starting point. But for Nietzsche, Descartes' so-called certainty is nothing more than a clever illusion, a mistake that, in trying to save reason, cuts us off from real life. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche directly challenges Descartes' cogito. His critique is clear. The thinking self is an illusion, a philosophical invention that ignores where thought really comes from, the body, instincts, and emotions. Immediate certainty, like Descartes', is naive. Thinking does not prove the existence of a subject. Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche questions something Descartes simply assumed, that there's a self behind our thoughts. But is there? really. For Nietzsche, this assumption is already a metaphysical mistake. Thought isn't something I produce. It just happens. It emerges from a web of impulses, desires, memories, sensations, most of them unconscious. Saying I think is, in Nietzsche's view, claiming ownership over a process that's far beyond our rational control. Descartes believed reason was our most trustworthy tool. Nietzsche flips that idea upside down. Thought is the last thing to arrive. The body comes first. Feelings come first. Life, raw, instinctive, tragic, comes before reason and often drives it. Our entire conscious apparatus is secondary. Life moves long before we start thinking about it, beyond good and evil. Nietzsche invites us to drop the fantasy that we're rational beings in control of our thoughts. Reason, he says, is a recent and fragile invention. It serves life, but it doesn't lead it. It's a tool, not a foundation. When we put reason at the center, as Descartes did, we make a classic mistake in Western philosophy. We forget the body, and here comes one of Nietzsche's boldest claims. The body is wiser than the mind. We are not floating thinking selves. We are bodies full of conflicting forces, drives, and emotions. Thinking is just one expression of life, and often a delayed one, trying to make sense of what's already happened. The subject is a fiction. Thinking doesn't need a thinker. There is only the process of thought, nothing more. Beyond good and evil. This critique goes beyond Descartes' metaphysics. It strikes at the heart of modern philosophy. The rational self, the transparent, conscious I, became the foundation for almost everything that followed. Kant based his ethics on the autonomy of reason. Rousseau built his politics on the general will. Even Marx relied on the idea of a conscious historical subject. In a way, they all inherited Descartes. Nietzsche breaks from all of it. For him, there is no independent, rational subject. There are forces. There are drives. What we call the self is just a temporary center, a surface effect, a grammatical illusion. We say, I think, but really, something in me thinks. Or more honestly, thinking is happening. This changes everything. If the I isn't the foundation, then ethics can't be based on rational duties. Politics can't rest on the idea of free, equal individuals. Truth can't come from universal mental criteria. All of that collapses. In its place, Nietzsche offers a philosophy of life, a body-based ontology, a psychology of emotion. Nietzsche challenges us. What kind of thoughts are born from our bodies? What truths come from our deepest impulses? When we feel fear, anger, or desire, that's not reason speaking, that's life. And that's the level Nietzsche wants to think from, not from the rational I, but from the primal forces that make us who we are. It is always the body that believes. Reason comes later to justify, beyond good and evil. Descartes distrusted the body. He thought our senses could deceive us, that the body was a machine, extended matter, separate from thought. Nietzsche responds with irony. It's not the body that lies, it's reason. Reason tries to convince us it's in charge when, in reality, it just follows what the body already wants. And this is the heart of Nietzsche's critique. Cartesian rationalism is, at its core, a symptom of fear. Fear of life's chaos. Fear of pain. Fear of instinct. Reason, with its craving for clarity and certainty, is a defense mechanism. Descartes tried to build truth, and in doing so, denied life. Nietzsche doesn't want certainties. He wants intensity. He wants a philosophy that embraces doubt, contradiction, and complexity. One that accepts we are made of fragments, instincts, and tensions. One that understands the self is not a foundation. It's a poetic fiction. Few thinkers were as bold and as fiercely attacked as Friedrich Nietzsche. But few were also so passionate about life. Nietzsche wasn't a nihilist in the shallow sense. He didn't want to destroy everything for fun. On the contrary, He wanted to affirm life in all its depth, with its pain and beauty, its chaos and creativity. And to do that, there was an enemy to confront, not political or scientific, but spiritual and moral: Christianity. In The Antichrist and on the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche launches some of his most intense attacks on the Bible and the Christian tradition. But his fight isn't just against a religion. It's against a type of morality that, in his view, has poisoned the human spirit for centuries. Christianity, to Nietzsche, is the most successful and most dangerous form of moral nihilism. Christianity is a metaphysics of executioners, the Antichrist. To understand Nietzsche's critique, you have to start with a radical point. He's not attacking faith as a personal belief. He's attacking Christian morality as a system of values. He's not concerned with whether God exists or not. His question is, what kinds of values does the Bible promote? What kind of human being does it shape? And what are the consequences of that for life? And his answer is devastating. Christian morality, according to Nietzsche, denies life at its core. It glorifies weakness as virtue, condemns instincts as sin, turns pain into merit, and suffering into a path to salvation. Instead of affirming the earth, the body, pleasure, and creative power, it teaches us to wait for rewards in some imaginary afterlife. For Nietzsche, the Bible is a handbook of world denial. Christianity is hostile to life. It promises another reality, and in doing so, curses this one: the Antichrist. The central figure in this critique is Jesus Christ, not the historical man, whom Nietzsche respects in some ways, but the version built by Christian tradition. The suffering, passive, forgiving Christ, turned into a symbol that says suffering is noble, loving your enemies is a virtue, and weakness is purity. Nietzsche sees this as the total inversion of life's values. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche digs deeper. He shows how, historically, values were flipped. The noble, once seen as strong, courageous, and full of vitality, were labeled evil, and the weak, the resentful, the powerless called themselves good. This, for Nietzsche, is where Christian morality comes from. Not from genuine goodness, but from envy and resentment. Christianity is the revenge of the weak. On the Genealogy of Morals, that revenge works subtly, by turning powerlessness into virtue. Those who can't win, forgive. Those who can't desire, punish themselves. Those who can't act, preach renunciation. Christian love, to Nietzsche, isn't greatness, it's resignation. Humility isn't wisdom, it's submission. Salvation isn't freedom, it's escape. And all of this is upheld by a book, the Bible. But Nietzsche's problem isn't just with the content, it's with the psychology of the people who wrote and interpreted it. The apostles, for example, were, to him, masters of resentment, men who couldn't handle reality. So they invented a fantasy world to cope with their sense of powerlessness. The New Testament, far from being a good news, is for Nietzsche the peak of life denial wrapped in metaphysical promises. He writes, with biting force, "The gospel died on the cross. What followed wasn't life, it was denial, the Antichrist." In practice, Christianity teaches that life is a rehearsal for something else. But Nietzsche asks, what if there is no afterlife? What if this is the only life we have? Then why were we taught to hate it, to be ashamed of our bodies, afraid of desire, and guilty for being human? Nietzsche's critique goes even deeper. He doesn't just say Christianity is wrong. He says it sickened the West. It created generation after generation of bent, guilty, resentful people, waiting for a redemption that never comes. Christian culture, in his eyes, is one of renunciation, conformity, and mediocrity. It kills the spirit before it even awakens. But Nietzsche isn't just tearing things down. He offers a way out. And it's not another religion or belief system. It's a revaluation of values. He says we need to let go of the values inherited from the Bible, not just the dogmas, but the Christian mindset itself. Guilt, sin, the afterlife, sacrifice. God is dead, and we have killed him. The gay science. This line isn't just edgy atheism. It's a call to responsibility. If God is dead, if absolute values are gone, then we are the ones who must create meaning. It's up to us to affirm life, not with obedience, but with power, with courage, with art, with will. Nietzsche proposes a new kind of spirituality, not based on denial, but on creation, a tragic, Dionysian spirituality that embraces pain without consolation, that loves life even in its cruelty, that says yes to the world as it is. The Bible taught us to long for paradise. Nietzsche invites us to make the earth the stage for our affirmation. So I'll ask you, do we still carry Christian values deep inside us, even when we think we've set ourselves free? Modern science, with its precision, its rigorous method, and its promise to explain the universe, is one of humanity's greatest achievements. But does it really understand us? Does it know what it means to live, to suffer, to create, to fall, to love, to lose your mind? For Nietzsche, the answer is no. He doesn't see modern science as an enemy, but as something limited. It's blind to what makes us truly human. In The Gay Science and Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche offers a powerful critique. Science, in its obsession with objectivity, has lost its ability to deal with tragedy, feeling, instinct, with life, in its full depth. What is truth? A mobile army of metaphors that have been forgotten as metaphors. The gay science. Scientific truth, Nietzsche says, isn't absolute. It's a construction, one interpretation among many. Science claims to reveal reality, but in truth, it organizes chaos based on its own chosen criteria, and then forgets that it chose them. Objectivity, its highest ideal, is a myth of neutrality, as if the scientist sees from nowhere. Nietzsche rejects this. There are no facts without interpretation. More than that, he sees this obsession with objectivity as a symptom of modern sickness, a desire to escape life, to avoid error, doubt, pain. The modern scientist wants to measure everything, classify everything, control everything. But life doesn't fit into formulas. Life is excess, ambiguity, contradiction. It's instinct, will, passion. When science ignores this, it becomes inhuman. Science treats life like something that can be dissected into dead pieces. Twilight of the Idols. Nietzsche respects scientific intelligence, but rejects its claim to replace philosophy, art, and tragedy. Modern scientists think they can tell us what the world is, what humans are, what time is, and give us security. But Nietzsche responds, we don't need security. We need meaning. We need intensity. We need the courage to face the abyss. And that's where science fails, because it goes silent in the face of suffering. It measures pain, but doesn't know what to do with it. It maps the brain, but doesn't understand love. It diagnoses madness, but doesn't listen to it. It avoids error, but it doesn't create. Modern science understands how the world works, but not the tragic heart of human existence. Science promises truths, but at what cost? At the cost of illusion, art, and the strength of life. The gay science. Nietzsche doesn't want to destroy science. He wants to put it back in its place. Science is a tool, not a source of meaning. It's one way of knowing, not the foundation of knowledge. When science tries to become philosophy, ethics, art, or spirituality, it fails, because it wasn't built for that. Modernity made a serious mistake, according to Nietzsche. It replaced the gods with scientific reason. When God died, many turned to science for comfort, certainty, and order. But science doesn't comfort. It doesn't save us from anxiety, mortality, or tragedy. It gives us explanations, not redemption. And that, for Nietzsche, isn't enough. Science, as the new religion, cold, precise, soulless. Twilight of the idols. Nietzsche is skeptical of scientism, the belief that science alone can give us everything we need. He mocks the man of science who thinks he's overcome myths, but who has really just swapped one myth for another. The myth of progress, of neutrality, of absolute reason. In the gay science, Nietzsche offers a different kind of knowledge, tragic wisdom, the kind that sees life as suffering, chaos, fleeting beauty, and still says yes to it. The kind that doesn't try to escape pain with theories, but transforms pain into creation. Science measures the world. The tragic spirit dances with it. We have art, in order not to die of the truth. The gay science. This is one of Nietzsche's most famous and deepest lines. Raw, scientific truth, cold and dehumanizing, can crush us. Knowing we're cosmic dust, that the universe has no purpose, that death is final, all of that might be true, but it's a truth that needs art if we're going to live with it. Nietzsche doesn't want us to reject science, but to balance it. With art, with philosophy, with myth, with the body, with instinct, with courage. He calls for a new kind of knowledge, not just rational, but fully human. A knowledge that includes mistakes, risk, the unconscious, the irrational. A kind of knowledge that doesn't split thinking from living. This kind of knowledge demands a new attitude. Nietzsche calls it the free spirit. A kind of person who isn't satisfied with formulas, who refuses to bow to any dogma, not even scientific ones. Someone who thinks with the body, feels with the mind, and creates values from the chaos of life. Life is deeper than any day could ever comprehend. The gay science. That line is a response to those who think understanding life is just about explaining it. Life isn't an equation, it's a plunge, and Nietzsche invites us to jump, even when there's no ground, even when all we have is the abyss and the freedom to dance on the edge of it. So now I ask you, do you think science alone can tell us how to live? Or do we need something more, art, philosophy, courage, to face the full depth of existence? Few philosophers were as relentless in their critiques as Nietzsche, and no target was more central to his work than Christian morality. More than just a theoretical disagreement, Nietzsche saw this as a spiritual war, a battle of values. For him, Christian morality didn't just shape the West, it poisoned the human soul. In On the Genealogy of Morality and the Antichrist, he delivers his most devastating claim. Christian morality is a denial of life. Nietzsche isn't interested in debating religious doctrines or beliefs themselves. What he focuses on is the value system Christianity promotes: humility, submission, forgiveness, guilt, sacrifice, obedience. For many, these are signs of virtue. For Nietzsche, they are symptoms of decay. Christianity is the morality of the weak, a morality of resentment against life, the Antichrist. In On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche explores the origins of what we now call morality, and his conclusion is unsettling. Our moral values weren't born from goodness, they were born from weakness. In the beginning, there were two moral systems, the morality of masters and the morality of slaves. Master morality was life-affirming. It celebrated strength, courage, nobility, beauty, and excellence. For the noble, good meant power, vitality, and greatness. Slave morality, which later evolved into Christian morality, was reactive. It came from resentment. The weak, unable to assert power, flipped the script. They called good everything that helped them survive: humility, obedience, surrender, and labeled evil anything that threatened them: strength, pride, pleasure, difference. It was with the weak and the failures that values became poisonous. First they called the strong evil, then they called themselves good. On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche called this the herd morality. It's a morality that flattens, that clings to the safety of the group, that fears the exceptional, the different, the ones who rise above. It promotes equality not out of justice, but out of envy, out of an inability to stand the sight of someone going further. The herd hates the wolf, not because the wolf is unjust, but because he reminds them of their own weakness. At the center of this herd, morality is resentment. And Nietzsche is sharp here. Resentment is a kind of psychological poison that the weak carry when they can't express their will openly. Instead of attacking, they retreat. Instead of acting, they judge. Instead of fighting, they condemn. Resentment doesn't confront, it reverses. It turns impotence into a moral standard. Christian morality, Nietzsche says, is the ultimate form of this reversal. It turns suffering into a virtue. It says the pure in heart, the ones who don't fight, don't desire, don't dominate, will inherit the earth. It promises a better life later to justify pain now. It says the last will be first. And Nietzsche asks, what if the last are last because they're weak? Why should they become the first? Every morality of resentment is a falsification of life's values. On the genealogy of morality. Another major part of Nietzsche's critique is the concept of guilt. In On the Genealogy of Morality, he argues that guilt isn't natural. It was invented, a tool of control. In ancient societies, punishment was physical and direct. But with Christianity, something new appeared. Inner punishment. Pain stopped being external. It became psychological. People were taught to feel guilty for their desires, instincts, even their existence. Nietzsche calls this bad conscience. It's what happens when the will to power, once expressed outwardly, is turned inward and begins to torture itself. Christianity taught us that we are born sinners, that we owe a debt, that we need salvation, and so we became a humanity bent over with shame, addicted to self-punishment. Man was poisoned against his instincts. On the Genealogy of Morality. But what Nietzsche finds even more damaging about Christian morality is its deep-rooted nihilism. It doesn't just repress instincts, it devalues life itself. By saying the real world is somewhere else, by promising heaven as a reward for earthly suffering, Christianity strips meaning from the present. The body becomes sinful, pleasure becomes temptation, power becomes arrogance, success becomes pride. The Christian ideal is that of a weak, obedient, submissive, silent man. The Christian hero is the martyr, the one who suffers, sacrifices, and dies. Nietzsche sees this as a culture of death, a cult of decline. That's why he writes in the Antichrist, Christianity is the great curse, the great revenge against life. The Antichrist. But Nietzsche doesn't just want to destroy. He wants to rebuild values from the ground up. His answer to Christian morality is what he calls the revaluation of all values. Instead of sin, power. Instead of guilt, affirmation. Instead of submission, creation. He proposes a new kind of ethics, not one based on denial, but on the courage to live fully, with pain and joy, with instinct and awareness. This is the path of the Übermensch, the overman, the one who goes beyond herd morality, who creates their own values, who says yes to life, even when it hurts. Someone who doesn't need salvation because they feel no guilt. Someone who doesn't wait for paradise because they want to transform the earth. Today, when we talk about democracy, we think of freedom, justice, and equality. We believe every human being should have the same rights, the same voice, the same value. But Nietzsche, always provocative, forces us to pause and ask, are people really equal? Is this ideal we celebrate so much truly a sign of progress, or maybe a sign of decline? In Beyond Good and Evil and On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche launches a direct attack on modern democracy, not because he prefers tyranny, but because he sees democracy as a symptom of the West's moral sickness, a result of herd morality, resentment, and the denial of the natural hierarchies that govern life. In his eyes, democracy doesn't liberate, it levels. It doesn't uplift greatness, it suffocates it. The doctrine of equality is faith in human mediocrity, beyond good and evil. Nietzsche isn't attacking the idea of political participation. What he critiques is the moral foundation of modern democracy, the belief that all people are equal in dignity, worth, and capability. For Nietzsche, that's not a truth, it's a fiction built, just like Christian morality, to protect the weak and block the rise of the strong. At the core of modern democracy lies the principle of equality, but Nietzsche sees this equality as a reactive instinct, born from resentment. It's the will of the herd, which, unable to create greatness, seeks to tear down anything above average. Instead of admiring excellence, genius, or the exceptional, the herd fears them. And so, it builds systems of values that lower the great and lift up the small. Morality based on compassion and equality is the morality of the last ones. Those who want no one to stand above so they don't feel below. On the genealogy of morality. In a democracy, everyone has a voice, but for Nietzsche, not every voice carries the same weight. Some spirits are higher, stronger, more creative. Some are born to lead, to transform, to set new paths. Others are born to follow. Treating everyone as equal, he says, goes against the nature of life itself, which is hierarchical, selective, tragic, and unequal. His critique of democracy is inseparable from his critique of resentment. Democracy presents itself as fair, but Nietzsche asks, fair for whom? For the strong, who need freedom to create, or for the weak, who crave safety and equality at any cost? In his view, the resentful don't just want justice, they want revenge. They don't just want to live well, they want to make sure others don't live better. And that mindset, Nietzsche says, is at the root of democratic morality, a psychology that turns envy into political principle and disguises fear of standing out as universal brotherhood. All calls for equality are deep down cries of, no, one should be better than me, beyond good and evil. What drives life for Nietzsche isn't comfort or safety, it's the will to power, the force that wants to grow, to impose, to create, to affirm. But in a culture dominated by democratic ideals, that will is suppressed. The strong are labeled arrogant. The exceptional are met with suspicion. Creativity is treated as a threat. In this sense, democracy discourages greatness. It promotes the average, the ordinary, the safe. Nietzsche couldn't accept that. He wanted a culture that pushes people to surpass themselves, not to conform to an imposed mold of sameness. Democracy wants to make everyone small, so no one feels small. On the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche also predicted something we now clearly see, the danger of mass culture. When everyone is treated the same, the individual disappears. The unique voice is drowned out by the crowd. Genius is crushed by bureaucracy. Freedom, once the highest expression of the human spirit, becomes conformity dressed up as virtue. Democracy, by valuing quantity over quality, creates a tyranny of the majority, a dictatorship of the mediocre. In such a world, what is right is simply what pleases the most people, not what challenges, uplifts, or transforms. For Nietzsche, this is the opposite of true culture. It's the triumph of the useful over the sublime. Nietzsche didn't believe in small reforms. He dreamed of a great politics, a deep transformation of culture and values. And that new culture, he believed, couldn't come from the democratic spirit. It had to be built by rare individuals. Free spirits, value creators, those with the strength to say yes to life in all its intensity. These people don't ask for equality, They ask for greatness. They don't want safety. They want radical freedom. They don't follow rules. They create new ones. Democracy, with its herd morality, is hostile to these beings. It's an environment where real freedom and true creation are nearly impossible. The Bhawanam, freedom of the strong isn't found in equality, it's found in transcendence, beyond good and evil. But does Nietzsche support tyranny? That's a common and important question. Nietzsche isn't proposing a return to authoritarianism or oppression. He's not advocating political tyranny. What he's criticizing is the moral flattening that comes with democracy. He doesn't believe the masses should decide what is valuable. He wants a world where the strong can flourish without being crushed by the envy of the weak. Nietzsche believes in hierarchy, but not one imposed from above. He believes in a natural hierarchy, one of spirit, of courage, of creative force. A world where those with more will, more vision, and more love for life can rise, without guilt, without restraint, and without needing permission. If something in you stirs as you hear these ideas, don't ignore it. Subscribe to the channel and keep challenging the old values with us. In 18th century Europe, people believed they had found the path to human liberation. Reason, science, and progress were the new gods meant to replace the old world of superstition, religion, and blind authority. Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, Kant, each in their own way, believed that the light of reason could wipe away the darkness of ignorance. That historical movement became known as the Enlightenment. But for Nietzsche, writing 2 centuries later, that light had another name: illusion. In The Gay Science and Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche attacks the heart of the Enlightenment project, not because he favored ignorance, but because he saw with cutting clarity that reason, when treated like a god, becomes just another form of blindness. Voltaire represents that modern optimism, the almost religious faith in rationality, tolerance, and moral progress, and Nietzsche is ready to tear it all down. Faith in reason is a refined form of superstition. The Gay Science. Nietzsche saw the Enlightenment as a desperate attempt to force order onto a chaotic world, to erase the tragic nature of life with formulas, systems, and ideals. But life, he said, is not rational. Life is will, pain, instinct, contradiction, impulse. Trying to explain it through pure reason is like trying to explain fire with ice. Voltaire believed that reason, properly used, would lead to peace, freedom, and justice. Nietzsche laughed at that optimism. To him, history doesn't move toward moral progress. Science doesn't save us. Morality doesn't redeem us. Reason doesn't bring us closer to truth or happiness. Humanity doesn't progress. It repeats. It forgets. It falls. Beyond good and evil. Nietzsche saw Enlightenment optimism as a denial of life's tragic nature. The world is suffering, chaos, death, and there are no guarantees. Voltaire, in trying to rationalize life, ends up flattening its depth, and the Enlightenment, with its promise of redemption through reason, simply repeats Christianity's mistake, offering salvation, but this time not in heaven, in the name of earth. Nietzsche doesn't want salvation. He wants to live with clarity, with intensity, with courage. For him, tragedy is not a flaw. It's the condition for greatness. Another core criticism Nietzsche had of the Enlightenment was its belief in universal morality. Kant, one of its heirs, argued that all rational beings should follow the same ethical principles. Voltaire believed in natural rights, universal truths that reason could uncover. Nietzsche saw this as yet another attempt to flatten human potential, to tame the spirit, to turn the exception into the rule. Universal morality is an invention of the weak to protect themselves from the strong. Beyond good and evil, for Nietzsche, there is no one-size-fits-all morality. There are only forces, and those forces create values. What the Enlightenment called moral reason, Nietzsche called disguised resentment. The moral vision of the Enlightenment, so praised by Voltaire, isn't the result of spiritual growth. It's a way to control and standardize life. The Enlightenment also created the myth that truth can be reached through reason. Nietzsche tore that myth down with brutal simplicity. Every truth is a metaphor. An illusion we've forgotten is an illusion. Science, philosophy, logic. They're all human creations. Tools we use to navigate a world that has no fixed meaning. There are no facts, only interpretations. The will to power, unpublished notes. While Voltaire believed that rational knowledge would set us free, Nietzsche warned, knowledge won't save us from the abyss. Reason doesn't eliminate tragedy, it just covers it with a mask. And the longer we wear that mask, the further we drift from real life. Nietzsche calls for a new kind of honesty, to admit that life doesn't fit into neat formulas. To live is to dive into chaos. It means creating meaning where there is none, affirming existence without needing guarantees. In place of Enlightenment reason, Nietzsche proposed the Dionysian spirit, the force that embraces excess, instinct, suffering, and joy all at once. Dionysus, the god of wine, dance, ecstasy, and tragedy, stands for everything the Enlightenment tried to suppress: instability, intensity, uncertainty. Voltaire stands for the world of Apollo, a world of clarity, symmetry, and order. Nietzsche wanted to go beyond that. He wanted to reclaim the creative power that comes from the darkness of life. He didn't want to explain existence. He wanted to dance with it. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. Thus spoke Zarathustra. One of the most iconic moments in the gay science is the phrase, "God is dead." But this God isn't just the religious one. It's also the God of reason, of morality, of objective truth. It's Voltaire's God, the God of Enlightenment science and progress. And Nietzsche asks, what will we do now, with no God, no absolute truth, no universal morality? What's left? What's left is freedom. What's left is the burden of creation. What's left is the responsibility of living without a safety net. And that, Nietzsche believed, is the greatest challenge for the modern spirit. He doesn't mourn the death of these gods, he celebrates it. Because now we're free to create new values, not based on rational systems, but based on life itself. Most people today believe in something that feels obvious, almost sacred, that every human being has equal, intrinsic, and inviolable value. We call this human dignity. It's the foundation of modern humanism, liberal democracies, human rights, and much of contemporary Western morality. But for Nietzsche, this belief is a moral invention, and worse, a dangerous lie. In On the Genealogy of Morals and Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche tears apart the idea that all humans are equal in value. For him, the concept of intrinsic dignity isn't a philosophical truth. It's a cultural construct born out of resentment, weakness, and a desperate attempt to deny life's natural hierarchies. Equal rights is a war against the noble human being, beyond good and evil. Humanism emerged during the Renaissance, gained momentum in the Enlightenment, and spread with modernity. It declares that humans are the center of the world, that they have absolute value just for existing, and that no difference in power, talent, or background should threaten that value. But Nietzsche asks, on what basis is this declared? Where does this dignity come from? Who decided it was real? For Nietzsche, the belief in absolute human value is a secularized version of Christianity. When God was abandoned, but the faith in human dignity was kept, all that changed was the language. Instead of being children of God, we became humans with inalienable rights, but the assumption stayed the same. Humans as sacred. Nietzsche rejects this comforting lie disguised as truth. Man is not an end in himself. He is a bridge, an experiment, a possibility. Thus spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche flips humanism on its head. He says, human beings don't have value by nature. Value isn't given, it's earned. A life's worth is in what it accomplishes, in how fully it affirms itself, in the strength it expresses. There are those who create, who overcome, who transform, and there are those who merely survive. Nietzsche sees no reason to pretend both carry the same existential weight. This view is harsh, but also liberating. It pulls us out of the comfort zone of guaranteed worth and throws us into the challenge of becoming worthy through merit, creativity, and strength. The human being, Nietzsche says, is a rope stretched between the animal and the overman. He's not a final product, he's a work in progress. What is noble? That which wants to rise above itself, that which despises the ease of equality, beyond good and evil. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche explains how the morality of equality was invented by the weak. Unable to compete with the strong, the resentful flipped the script. They called strength tyranny, excellence arrogance, pride sin. Then they claimed that everyone has the same worth, not out of greatness, but out of fear of greatness. From this angle, humanism isn't an ethical triumph. It's an emotional scam. It turns fear into virtue, conformity into law. Human dignity, so often praised, is just a conceptual crutch to avoid confronting the truth of difference. The morality of the weak says, everyone is equal, but what it really means is, no one should be greater. On the Genealogy of Morals, instead of universal dignity, Nietzsche proposes a new measure, the will to power. It's not about what someone is by default, it's about what they become through action, courage, and value creation. A life's worth is found in its ability to grow, to overcome, to express strength, not in its origin. Nietzsche isn't saying we should crush the weak. What he critiques is a moral system that glorifies weakness as if it were moral superiority, one that rewards passivity and turns vulnerability into a badge of honor. To him, there's no glory in being a victim. There's glory in rising. Humanism, with its generalized compassion and worship of equality, gets in the way of the strong. It creates a culture of protection, but not of creation. It ensures survival, but not excellence. That's why Nietzsche calls it a sign of cultural decay. What's highest in life is not what's given, but what's earned through struggle, beyond good and evil. Nietzsche draws a clear line between two types of people, the noble and the equalizing. The noble doesn't need to be better than others. He simply is. His worth comes from within, from his ability to create, to endure, to transform. He affirms life without begging for validation. The equalizer, on the other hand, judges everything by comparison. His dignity is fragile because it must be granted by society, laws, or social recognition. He doesn't affirm himself, he demands to be accepted. Nietzsche calls this equalizing spirit the herd. It wants safety, not freedom. It wants inclusion, not transcendence. It wants belonging, but doesn't dare to stand out. What is freedom? Courage in the face of inequality. On the Genealogy of Morals. What if we're not equal? Nietzsche's final challenge is this. What if we're not equal? What if dignity isn't a right, but a task? What if the value of a life depends on how boldly it lives, how much it creates, how deeply it embraces chaos? Nietzsche doesn't want to destroy the idea of humanity. He wants to elevate it. He wants us to abandon comfortable illusions and face the truth. Life is unequal, and that inequality isn't a flaw, it's an opportunity, a chance to grow, to evolve, to become who we truly are. So now I ask you, do you believe that all human lives have the same value? Or do you think, like Nietzsche, that value must be earned? There are moments in human history when old certainties collapse. When the pillars holding up our worldview fall, what's left is the abyss. So, what do we do when we're staring into it? Run, despair, or face it and dance above it? That's the question Nietzsche poses to the modern world. And it's where one of the most important themes in his philosophy comes in: nihilism. But Nietzsche isn't just talking about a philosophical problem. He's diagnosing a spiritual crisis that runs through modern life. A crisis that begins with a famous statement from the Gay Science, section 125. God is dead, and we are the ones who killed him. It's a well-known quote, but rarely taken seriously. Nietzsche wasn't just saying that belief in God had ended. He was pointing to something deeper. The death of God marks the collapse of all absolute values, eternal truths, and metaphysical foundations. It's the end of faith, not just religious faith, but also moral, political, and philosophical. It's the emptiness that remains when meaning from out there disappears. And that emptiness has a name: nihilism. Nietzsche identifies two types of nihilism: passive and active. Passive nihilism appears when we lose faith in traditional values, but don't yet have the strength to create new ones. It's a phase of paralysis, fatigue, and resignation. Life goes on, but without color, without passion, without purpose. Nihilism as decay, the suspicion that everything is meaningless, that nothing has value, that everything is in vain. The will to power. The passive nihilist no longer believes, but doesn't have the courage to reject belief outright either. They no longer hope for salvation, but still live as if something will save them. It's a life marked by apathy, conformity, and a deep spiritual exhaustion. This is the person who says nothing matters, but still obeys the rules. Who claims life has no meaning, but is afraid to create their own. Who doubts everything, but doesn't dare to invent anything new. For Nietzsche, this is the portrait of modern decline, a spirit tired and empty, drifting without direction. Man would rather will nothing than not will at all. The will to power. This line captures the tragedy when a person loses the ability to desire, to strive, to create. They cling to nothingness, to habits, to routine, to old morals, even if they no longer believe in them. They're not truly living, just avoiding death. But Nietzsche doesn't want us to stay trapped in that emptiness. He sees nihilism as a transition, a bridge between the decay of old values and the birth of something new. That's why, instead of mourning the death of God, he celebrates it, because now we are free. Now we can become who we truly are. We must become gods ourselves if we are to be worthy of having killed God. The will to power. Nietzsche's challenge to us is clear. What will you do now that there's no promised heaven, no absolute commandments, no guaranteed destiny? Will you give in to passive nihilism, living on autopilot, complaining about the world while doing nothing? Or will you rise like a free spirit, ready to create your own meaning? Nietzsche's answer to passive nihilism is what he calls active nihilism. This is where a person realizes there's no given meaning, and instead of giving up, embraces this as ultimate freedom. The active nihilist tears down old idols, not out of hate, but to make space for something new. It's in this process that the idea of the Übermensch is born, the overman, the creator of values. This isn't a biologically superior being, but a new kind of human, one who doesn't need external validation to live a meaningful life. The Übermensch embraces life fully, the pain, the chaos, the tragedy, with no need for metaphysical anesthesia. Man is something to be overcome. Thus spoke Zarathustra. This overcoming isn't easy. It takes inner strength, philosophical courage, and the will to resist despair. It means saying yes to the world, even when everything screams no. It means accepting that life has no ultimate justification, and still loving it as if each moment were eternal. To avoid falling into passive nihilism, Nietzsche offers the idea of amor fati, love of fate, not as resignation, but as radical acceptance of life, exactly as it is. To accept everything, even pain, loss, failure, and death, and still say, I want it all again. My formula for human greatness: amor fati, to want nothing to be different, not in the past, not in the future, not just to bear the necessary, but to love it. Exe homo. The passive nihilist says, if nothing matters, why go on? Nietzsche answers, if nothing matters, then make it matter. Create, live, turn your life into a work of art, and that's when philosophy stops being theory and becomes destiny. Nietzsche isn't calling us to despair. He's calling us to create. The new human will be an artist of life. They won't search for meaning in dogma, but in the act of living boldly. They'll laugh at the abyss, dance in the chaos, turn pain into power, and transform uncertainty into drive. Passive nihilism keeps us stuck. Active nihilism sets us free. But that freedom comes at a cost. It demands that we take full responsibility for ourselves. No crutches, no promises, no guarantees. In the history of philosophy, Aristotle holds a place of balance. He was a thinker of measure, harmony, and orderly reason. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he defined virtue as the golden mean between two extremes. Courage, for example, lies between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the balance between stinginess and extravagance. For Aristotle, virtue is about moderation, and moderation aligns with reason. But centuries later, Nietzsche arrives like a thunderclap across this calm sky. For him, life isn't found in the middle, it's found in the excess. Existence isn't about balance, it's about intensity. Where Aristotle preaches restraint, Nietzsche celebrates overflow. Where the first sees wisdom in caution, the second sees weakness disguised as virtue. Even though he rarely mentions Aristotle directly, Nietzsche completely rejects the Aristotelian spirit. What is good? Everything that heightens the feeling of power. What is bad? Everything that comes from weakness. The Antichrist. The ethics of moderation versus the aesthetics of power. Aristotle's ethics aim at fulfilling human nature. A life well lived, eudaimonia, achieved through cultivating virtue. But this virtue is guided by reason and aimed at harmony. A good life is a functional balance where each part performs its role with restraint. The virtuous person is the one who controls desires, avoids extremes, and acts with thoughtful judgment. Nietzsche, however, is deeply suspicious of moderation. He sees it not as a higher form of living, but as an attempt to domesticate existence. Reason isn't humanity's noblest trait. It's just a tool, and often a trap. True life, Nietzsche says, pulses in instinct, in creative impulse, in risk, in Dionysian intoxication. What's necessary? To become who you are, to live with intensity, not caution. Exe homo. Where Aristotle seeks stability, Nietzsche seeks motion. Aristotle's ethics try to mold a man into a rational ideal. Nietzsche wants to break the mold and let the individual create something new. For Aristotle, humans find their essence through reason. We have a natural function, ergon, to live according to rationality. Virtue, then, is about perfecting that nature. That's why his ethics are based on norms, flexible, sure, but still norms, aimed at stable happiness. Nietzsche rejects the idea that humans have some fixed essence to realize. To him, we don't have essence. We have will. A will to power, to overcome, to self-create. The Nietzschean human doesn't fulfill a preset nature, they become who they are. There are no facts, only interpretations. And among those, some are more powerful, the will to power. So life shouldn't be lived like someone fulfilling a role, but like someone crafting a work of art. There's no middle ground, no rational norm that fits everyone. Each person must find their own path, and that path won't be made of balance, but of bold choices, of tragic affirmation, of loving the risk. You can also read the contrast between Nietzsche and Aristotle as a clash between the tragic and the Apollonian. Aristotle admired symmetry, serenity, a life guided by reason, like a finely sculpted statue. Nietzsche, especially in The Birth of Tragedy, drew inspiration from Greek tragedy, where Dionysus embodies the life force that explodes past reason's limits. Dionysus represents intoxication, suffering, death, and rebirth, a life that doesn't avoid pain but transforms it into expression. Where Aristotle avoids excess, Nietzsche dives in and comes out stronger. Beauty, for Nietzsche, is born from the abyss, not from balance. We have art, so we don't die of the truth. The gay science. Art is the only worthy answer to the chaos of existence. It's lived art, not as decoration, but as resistance to life's tragic truth. Reason may organize us, but it can't save us from pain. Only creation, tragic laughter, and aesthetic courage can do that. Aristotle valued phronesis, practical wisdom. The wise person chooses the right middle ground at the right time in the right way. Nietzsche sees this as the triumph of mediocrity. Too much prudence is cowardice. Too much caution is fear of life. The overly cautious man doesn't dare, doesn't create, doesn't risk. He just survives. Nietzsche proposes the opposite, radical affirmation. Not a good life, but a dancing, dangerous, unapologetic life. The Nietzschean ideal isn't the moderate citizen, but the artist, the warrior, the free thinker, someone who asserts their will, even against the world, the gods, even against themselves. Excess is what makes a man great. The gay science. Aristotle saw virtue as something everyone could access, even if not everyone reached it. Nietzsche, on the other hand, sees a hierarchy of existence. Not everyone is capable of intense, tragic, creative life. Moderation serves the herd. But for those with strength, courage, genius, the middle is a prison. That's why, for Nietzsche, virtue can't be universal. It can't be the same for everyone. Trying to normalize virtue, like Aristotle does, is a way of reducing life to predictability. Nietzsche wants the opposite, life as exception, as creative chaos. If something inside you stirs when you hear these ideas, don't ignore it. Subscribe to the channel and keep challenging the old values with us. Friedrich Nietzsche wasn't just a philosopher. He was a seismograph of the modern soul. He told us that God was dead, that our values were rotten, that truth was an illusion, and that humanity was something to be overcome. But maybe his boldest move was something else entirely. He turned against himself. In Ecce Homo, his final book before his mental collapse, Nietzsche rereads his own philosophy with self-criticism, irony, and a tone that's both grand and tragic. Why am I so wise? Why am I so clever? Why do I write such good books? Ecce Homo. That line, which might sound egotistical at first, is actually much more than a provocation. It's the beginning of a deep self-examination, where Nietzsche plays with the myth of genius, the image of the cursed philosopher, and his own journey. Ecce Homo isn't a book of vanity. It's a cracked mirror, where he faces his excesses, his flaws, and the inevitable tension between the nihilism he described so clearly and the self-overcoming he demanded of himself. Nietzsche was a master of critique. He tore apart the foundations of Christianity, traditional morality, Western metaphysics, modern science, and egalitarian ideologies. But in Ecce Homo, he turns the lens on himself, showing that his own work isn't immune to the critique he built. He goes back through his books one by one, freely pointing out what he got right and what he could have said better. He admits, for example, that in The Birth of Tragedy, his first book, he was still heavily influenced by Schopenhauer and Wagner, two figures he would later criticize sharply. He acknowledges there was a certain romanticism in his youth, a desire to escape through aesthetics, but at the same time, He defends that the core of his tragic philosophy was already there, the idea that life can only be endured if it's transformed through art. The error was great, but necessary. It was the soil where my truth grew. Ecce homo on the birth of tragedy. That ability to revise himself is rare in the history of philosophy. Nietzsche doesn't hide his contradictions, he highlights them. He knows he's not above what he critiques. He doesn't pose as a flawless prophet. He sees himself as an experimenter of existence, someone constantly revaluing even his own ideas. Ecce homo is also deeply ironic. Nietzsche exaggerates, provokes, shocks. When he asks, "Why am I so wise?" he's mocking the serious academic biographies. When he claims Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the greatest book ever written, he's not just praising his work, he's satirizing the philosophical tradition itself, which often takes itself way too seriously. But that irony isn't empty. It's a form of resistance against passive nihilism. Nietzsche knew the modern spirit was tired, faithless, burnt out. So he used laughter, exaggeration, radical affirmation, not to deny the crisis, but to push through it. Laughing at yourself, in this context, is a sign of strength. And Nietzsche, in that sense, laughs with clarity, even standing on the edge. Maybe the deepest tension in Nietzsche's work, and the one he most openly faces in Ecce Homo, is this: how do you overcome nihilism without falling into a new system, a new faith? Nietzsche tears down all foundations, exposes the lack of meaning, and yet still demands that we not give in to despair. He writes about the death of God, the collapse of morality, the absence of truth, and still offers amor fati, the eternal, return, the Übermensch. But how can you sustain that? How do you not fall into the same trap he's warning us about, the trap of creating new idols? Beware of idealists, they bleed too easily. And then they call their weakness morality, beyond good and evil. Nietzsche knows it's not easy to affirm life without reaching for transcendence. That's why he doesn't give ready-made answers. He gives images, provocations, tensions. The eternal return, for instance, isn't a doctrine. It's an existential test. He asks, if you had to live your life exactly as it is, over and over forever, would you say yes to it? If yes, you've overcome nihilism. If not, you're still trapped in it. And Nietzsche knew he himself struggled with that. In Ecce Homo, he tries to place himself at the peak, the point of total affirmation. But any careful reader can sense that behind the strength, there's fragility. Behind the clarity, there's despair. Behind the irony, there's pain that was never denied. Nietzsche isn't a systematic philosopher. He's a living drama. His philosophy is his life, his suffering, his creation. That's what makes Ecce Homo so unique. It's not just a book about philosophy. It's a philosophical self-portrait of a man at war with himself. He doesn't offer us a solution. He offers us the courage to keep going, even without one. He teaches us that strength isn't in resolving contradictions, but in enduring them, living with them, dancing with them. Become who you are. Ecce Homo. That might be the most beautiful line in all his work, because it doesn't tell you to be some ideal person. It tells you to become real, with your pain, your failures, your abyss, but also with your strength, your freedom, your ability to create meaning even in chaos. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for joining me on this philosophical journey. If this video made you think, challenged your beliefs, or sparked something new in you, then it was already worth it. Now, I want to invite you to be part of a community that thinks and feels on a deeper level. So make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next, and leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. And of course, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. If this video spoke to you in any way, share it with someone who also needs to hear these ideas. Philosophy becomes even more powerful when it's shared.